So thank you folks for joining us today. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuary series. This is Nick Sobel with Science Collaborative. Today's webinar is featuring a science transfer project that used an innovative collaborative learning approach. As Chris says, it's capital C and capital L to facilitate the application of geospatial tools developed by USGS to marsh projects in Maine. As always, before we get started, I just have a quick introduction to the reserve system and the Science Collaborative program. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities you can see on the slide there, which include land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training and education and engagement programs to the public and local officials, and education. Science Collaborative Program's mission is to support collaborative research that addresses coastal management issues that are important to the reserve system and that strengthens the system's ability to impact coastal management and decision-making. One important way we meet this goal is by sharing these collaborative science accomplishments publicly through a variety of channels, including this webinar series, Collaborative Science for Estuaries, which features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative program staff and partners. Webinars are both a way for us to share project impacts more broadly and also a really valuable learning opportunity for our program. Insights from speakers and participants like you can help inform how we support others in doing collaborative science, for example, in the development of future workshops and webinars, or resources such as tools, tips, and case studies for our open access guide to collaborative science, which can be found on our website. And with that in mind, we just want to inform attendees that any insights or feedback you share, for example, in chat or via a webinar exit survey, may be used for program learning and development purposes. Please note that if we capture a direct quote from you that we like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you beforehand to seek permission and provide an explanation of its use. Any direct quotes would only be used anonymously. So quick note on housekeeping. All attendees are muted upon entry, as you probably noticed. We'll be handling presentation-related questions via Zoom's Q&A feature, or you can type them in the chat. We'll be watching both. You can enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar. We'll plan to discuss as many as we can at the end of the presentation. You can also verbalize questions during Q&A if you raise your hand. Just let us raise your hand, and organizers will see it, and we'll confirm you're to come off mute and ask your question verbally when it's your turn. Chat should be visible to all. If not, I'll double check that in a moment. So please use that to talk amongst yourselves and ask organizers support or technical questions. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers for today. Chris Feurt is the coastal resilience scientist at the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve in Maine and a research associate in the School of Marine and Environmental Science at the University of New England. She served as the project and collaborative lead for this project, and Neil Ganju is a research oceanographer at the U.S. Geological Survey, Woods Hole Coastal and Marine Science Center. And I don't remember which one of you I'm passing to first, so I'll just stop slide share, and whoever's going first can take over.
Yeah, that'll be me. Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to do a screen share. All right, again, welcome everyone. We got a couple storytellers today to share the story of Marshes for Maine's future. Neil and I are going to tell the story, but we're representing about 20 other organizations who worked with us on this project with the goal of catalyzing geospatial knowledge to build marsh resilience. So I put this up here to kind of share the 17 organizations that worked with us on this project for almost 2 years. And they worked with us to prepare the grant so that the project would be addressing their needs. And I'll ask you guys to kind of share also and think about the kinds of organizations that work on tidal marshes in your area. Now, Nick, where do we have the survey question?
It's loaded in, so whenever you want me to launch it, I can launch it. You can do that now.
Yeah, so while we're thinking of all the people that were involved in Maine, let's try that survey to see who's here on the call today. So
Sure.
what we'd like to know is there's kind of 3 areas of expertise that were involved in this project. If you are someone who develops geospatial tools for use by practitioners, there's a choice for you. If you're someone who uses geospatial tools in your work with natural ecosystems, or if you are a boundary spanner who facilitates collaboration and the transfer and co-creation of knowledge, or other. So if you'll take a minute to kind of weigh in so we can see who's out there today. And I realize there might be people that do 2 things, but I think this was the only way we could do the poll. You might be both a tool developer and a person using the results of the tool, but this will just give us an idea.
All right, but 3/4 of people have answered, so I will end the poll and I will share the results here.
All right. Tool developers, 18%. Users, 44%. Oh, yay, there's some boundary spanners because a lot of the presentation today will be geared toward those boundary spanners in addition to the others. All right, thank you guys. Now I put this picture up both for kind of orient, if there's anyone from far away who doesn't know where Maine is, we have a coastline, if you include all the inlets and bays, of almost 3,500 miles. But as the crow flies, the coast is about 238 miles. The places that we studied for this project are right along the coast. And I wanted to say something about this particular marsh here. Looking at the marsh, different people see different things. And that list before of the 17 organizations, they do many different kinds of work in salt marshes. But we named the project Marshes for Maine's Future because no matter what people are doing in marsh, they're all working to sustain Marshes for Maine's Future. So we use that title. I had a very strict rule. No one could turn it into an acronym, so that every time people said the name of the project, Marshes for Maine's Future, they were talking about our mission. And every opportunity where we said Marshes for Maine's Future, we were educating people about our work. These were the kinds of things that our marsh managers were doing. The first 5 are all related to the kinds of work that the geospatial tools would address, and could be prioritizing restoration and conservation, evaluating strategies, developing nature-based solutions, managing for biodiversity, and communicating. One of the goals, though, was a little bit different. It was about demonstrating best practices for creation and transfer of USGS coastal wetland synthesis projects through the NERRS. But the methods we developed can be used by any organization. We use the collaborative learning research approach, which we've worked on here at the Wells Reserve for 20 years with the help of other units in the reserve system, as well as the Science Collaborative. And collaborative learning is built upon kind of 3 different foundational theories about conflict management, adult learning, and systems thinking. So that all comes through in the training approach. The resilience dialogue that you see on the corner is a guidebook that we developed earlier with about 13 different reserves for how to do collaborative learning, a very practitioner-focused guide. And collaborative learning is the skill, I call it a method for boundary spanning. And the method of collaborative learning, it's just like a scientific method that we're all familiar with, only it's about how to bridge that gap between products of science like geospatial science to things like habitat restoration. And all the tools we developed that I'll share later serve to apply social science to doing this kind of work as a boundary spanner. Now I'm going to turn the program over to Neil Ganju now, but I just want to tell just a really quick Genesis story about literally how Neil got roped into this. I was surfing the web and reading about tools for marsh restoration science, and I found a USGS page talking about a project that Neil was working on. And I said, I think this would really help people in Maine. So I just called Neil and I said, we've got this need in Maine for the new tools that you're developing. And he signed on, and you probably never knew how complicated it would be, but he was willing. And this is the key ingredient for doing this, finding a scientist that's practitioner focused. And now I'll turn it over to Neil to talk about the geospatial tools.
Thank you, Chris. And I think you might have actually made a phone call, if I remember correctly. It wasn't an email, it was an actual phone call, and I picked the phone.
Someone's calling me.
Yeah. Well, all praise goes to Chris for starting this project and making it happen. And indeed, and I should be in full screen now, indeed, Maine is actually a pretty difficult place to work, not because of the people are great, but the coastline and the size of the marshes is very different than a place like Chesapeake Bay, where we've built a lot of these techniques. But that made it actually a great challenge for us to be able to kind of modify our products and communicate them in a way that was useful for all those agencies because of the scale of the marshes and the unique problems facing each one. I want to make sure I acknowledge Kate and Zafir. They're the architects of the geospatial methods you're going to see. And Kate was one of the partners in this project here when we had our collaborative learning sessions with Chris and the rest of the team. And I want to thank Chris, obviously, for all the work she has done on this. Wouldn't have happened without her. So when we talk about geomorphic vulnerability of salt marshes in our program at the USGS, we're really thinking about three main processes. So if this was an idealized salt marsh you see here in your picture, we have edge erosion operating on the seaward edge where waves are eroding marshes constantly and kind of removing marsh plain. You have internal deterioration that's happening within the marsh plain, and this can be expansion of ponds, it can be conversion of plain to open water pans or anything else. It can be expansion of channel edges, but basically loss of marsh plain either due to things like sea level rise, sediment deficits, invasive rodents, crabs, eutrophication, right? We know there's a number of factors that create internal deterioration, but ultimately the way you identify that is through loss of marsh plain and subsidence of the marsh plain. And then lastly, we have migration potential. So the ability of marsh to move upland into forests or undeveloped land or agricultural lands. And as we know, that's pretty complicated. It can be a function of slope, it can be a function of rainfall, salinity of the groundwater, land use, canopy cover. But these three terms are basically what control how much salt marsh you have, and therefore what ecosystem services they have in terms of flood protection, habitat, recreation, etc. So in our project about 10 years ago, or maybe more now, I guess 13 years ago, we really started working on internal deterioration. And coming from a sediment transport background, I wanted to tie internal deterioration to sediment transport. And that's not a new concept. That's been around since really Redfield, if not even prior to that. Redfield's earliest paper talked about the importance of sediment moving in and out of channels to maintain how much marsh you have. And he didn't do it explicitly like that, but if you read his 1972 paper closely, you'll see sediment transport and sea level rise invoked many places implicitly. So we went out, and I'm skipping a lot of background here because I think folks have seen it, but the big point here is we went out and measured sediment budgets at 8 marshes around the country. And that's what you're seeing here on the y-axis of this plot. And negative means sediment was leaving each of these complexes. And we wanted to tie that to some independent metric. And literally the first one we focused on was percent open water. We ended up converting that to unvegetated vegetated ratio, what we now call the UVVR. And what you can see here is a very good relationship between those other things. So the first thing to note in this plot is that all of our sites were in a deficit. So not a single site was importing enough sediment to keep up with sea level rise. The second thing you can see is the strong correlation between the two, where sites with a low UVVR, which is good, were basically had a neutral sediment budget, and sites with a high UVVR were exporting massive amounts of sediment. What's interesting, those 2 points there in orange are literally 1 or 2 kilometers apart from each other. One is Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. The other one is Fishing Bay Wildlife Management Area, both in the Chesapeake. Right next to each other, but very different things happening due to hydrodynamics and histories of sea level rise, subsidence, and sediment deficits. The third thing I want you to see is that there's a tipping point around 0.1, 0.15, which we've actually identified in other studies where marshes seem to go from a stable trajectory to a conversion, runaway conversion to open water. Now, none of this is really, in my mind, is not really that novel of an idea. If you have a loss of vegetated plain, whatever the cause, you're losing vegetation, you're liberating sediment from the marsh plain, you're reducing the ability to trap sediment that may come in, and you're going to have this kind of runaway feedback where you start to lose more and more marsh as you convert more and more to open water. And that's why this UVR has become so powerful. Now, what happened here when we did this measurement is to get the UVVR that correlated spatially with a sediment budget, we had to draw little watersheds. So where we measured the sediment budget, we need to have a watershed that matches where water comes in and out of that marsh area. And so that's how the UVVR was developed. So what you can see here are 3 of those watersheds where we made measurements. So again, this is Fishing Bay here. So the entrance point to our measurement site was right here where the blue is intersecting this big tidal channel. And everything you see in orange is vegetated plain, everything in blue is unvegetated. And this was done with aerial imagery, which I'll talk about in a second. This middle spot here with the UVR 0.4 was Reedy Creek, New Jersey. So extensive ditching, some open water ponding. And then Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge with its really degraded marsh plain that's converted to open water with a UVVR of 1. Another reason we chose the UVVR instead of percent open water is the fact that Blackwater, which was our worst site, had a UVVR of 1. So that seemed like a really reasonable end member for the metric. So having done this, we're like, well, maybe we should be doing marsh units everywhere. So how do we do that? So we started with the same basic technique. So we start with the National Wetlands Inventory to basically draw a mask of what wetlands we're considering. And so for the most part, throughout the Northeast, we use estuarine emergent wetlands and then NWI classification. And then we use the USGS CONA data set, which is usually based on LIDAR, to break the marsh into individual tide sheds. So this is just like a watershed, water drop analysis. And we constrain the sizes of those marsh units so they end up being somewhat on the order of 20,000 square meters. So about the size of a couple football fields or so, maybe a little larger on average. As small as 900 square meters and as big as upwards of that, depending on the morphology and the topography. Then we use aerial imagery from the NAEP program to classify every little pixel within those marsh units as vegetated or unvegetated. And this is done with an unsupervised, supervised classification where we literally go in and identify which types of imagery are vegetated or not. And then from that, you can aggregate these pixels up to get a UVVR score. So anything you're seeing in green is a marsh with a low UVVR, which is healthy. Anything going into the white and pink colors is unhealthy because it's got significant open water and more vulnerability to runaway open water conversion. The other metric that we produce on marsh units is the lifespan. And I'm not going to get heavily into this other than to say it's kind of a relative metric that takes a sea level rise deficit, which you see here on the right. So this is just whatever the sea level rise rate is, which is, units of length per unit time, applied over the area of a marsh unit. That gives you a sediment deficit in volume. Using density, you can then get that in terms of mass. So now you have a mass deficit of sediment that the marsh needs to keep up with sea level rise. We also consider internal deterioration from open water conversion. So that's a function of the UVVR and the density. So we have these two sources of sediment loss. We divide that, that gets divided by the mass in the sediment in the vegetated plain. So you can imagine a marsh being a pool of sediment. You have an export coming from it. How long do I have before that mass in the marsh plain is kind of cannibalized in order to keep up with sea level rise? And that's the lifespan. And we have a couple papers on that, but I'm not going to get into heavy detail on that, but I am going to use it a little later. All right. So this is an example of what those geospatial tools look like for a marsh complex in Maine. So on the left here, I'm just showing individual marsh units. The colors mean nothing. It's just so you can kind of see their scale. You can see them spatially differentiated. You can see that they vary in size, and that's depending on the topography, which delineates how water moves through them. So here on the left, we have maybe 100 or so marsh units in this marsh complex. Here on the right, you're seeing the polygons of unvegetated and vegetated areas that have been classified using the NAEP imagery. So I wanted to show this set of images to kind of differentiate between what's on the left and what's on the right. So on the right, we just have basically a map of what's vegetated or not. And certainly any one of us could look at an aerial image of this marsh and do the same thing with our hand and squinting and zooming in and draw it, right? But we're using machine learning or unsupervised classification to do that, right? So that's the one difference. The second thing I want to point out, though, is that this map on its own is actually not that helpful because what will a practitioner do? I guess a practitioner might say, okay, we have a bunch of open water here in the middle of this marsh unit, but I kind of knew that because, I've been on the ground there. There's impoundments there. What's your point? So you have to kind of aggregate these data up in order to give kind of spatially relevant metrics to practitioners. And that's kind of what we're getting into here and what we were trying to communicate and work on with the rest of the team. So again, aggregating up the data. So on the right now is that unvegetated, vegetated classification data aggregated up to marsh units to compute the UVVR. And I'm sorry I didn't put a color scale. It's the same color scale as the other plot where anything in white or pink is above that threshold. So for example, these are the kinds of tools that we provide online and we provided to our partners. So here's a map of this marsh. You can click on this marsh unit in ArcGIS or on our online viewer, and you get the relevant metrics. So you get the distinct ID of that marsh unit, you get its total area, you get its vegetated area, you get the elevation metrics, amongst which are the elevation of the vegetated part of the plain, only the vegetated part. You can get the whole unit too, but this is just the vegetated part, which is useful for doing the lifespan, relative to the mean tide level using the VData model. We calculate the UVVR, which is just that unvegetated area divided by the vegetation. So 0.75, that's pretty bad. That's, again, if you remember on that prior image, it's a heavily pounded, degraded area. And then our lifespan metrics. And an interesting story about the lifespan. So this lifespan here, GMSL 10, that's the number of years under a 1 meter global sea level rise by 2100. That's the number of years before that marsh unit has been converted entirely to a mudflat, okay? Now, when we showed these data in our very first meeting, Jake from the team basically pointed out to me that these numbers are sometimes problematic. So there was one marsh unit that had a lifespan of 500 years, which is pretty high, but the marshes in Maine are actually quite high elevation-wise, which is good for lifespan. And some of them are intact, which is good for lifespans. So some of them had 500-year lifespans. And Jake pointed out that, I can't go to a meeting and show these data to someone who's concerned about or going to fund restoration and say, oh, you got 500 years. Because they're going to say, well, if we've got 500 years, we're not doing anything. And one might argue that even with 130 years, a practitioner or a manager might say, well, that's not an imminent threat. Well, the fact is for Maine, 130 years actually is pretty imminent. That's a marsh in pretty bad shape. And this is 130 years before everything is lost. So you're going to have degradation. You can see there's already degradation, but this is telling you that 130 years, that marsh is functionally shallow water habitat for whoever wants to be there, whether it's diving ducks or crabs or whoever, but there's not any marsh plain that's giving you the ecosystem services that we expect from marshes. It's already degraded in 130 years, it's completely gone. Now, again, that map is useful, but what's more useful is mapping decisions onto the landscape. So this is a decision matrix that we published in that Chesapeake Bay paper. It has since been called the PRIME framework by folks in New Jersey, and I think that's great. I know Chris and I both agree on acronyms. We don't like them, but when someone else does it with your stuff, I think it's okay. So it's PRME. It's the PRIME framework. So feel free to call it that, and we'll know what you're talking about. But the idea is if you had this map of marsh units and you have these metrics mapped, is there a way to distill that even further? So one of the first things we realized is that we have lots of marshes that are all over this parameter space. There's some that are high in elevation, but also high in UVVR. There's some that are low in elevation, but low in UVVR. So what does that mean? So if you're in this top left quadrant, you're a marsh that's high in elevation and low UVVR. So you're fully intact. So nothing really to do other than protect that unit, facilitate upland migration. If you're in the bottom right, you're now a marsh unit that's having trouble, right? You're low in elevation, you're high in UVVR. So you're both low in the tide frame and you're falling apart laterally. That might be a unit where you look at it and you say, well, I don't have any endangered species there. It's not protecting any infrastructure. It's not big recreational habitat. It might not be worth a restoration project. On the other hand, if you've got, the one last clapper rail or the one last salt marsh sparrow on that unit, maybe you do restore it. Bottom left, you have units that are low in elevation, but low in UVVR. So there's not much you can do from a restoration standpoint, but you can establish a monitoring protocol to investigate why the elevation is low. Maybe it's behind a tidal restriction, maybe there's a lack of sediment, and look at causes. And then the most interesting box is the top right. So these are marsh units that are high in elevation relative to the tide level, but they're also high in UVVR. So they have some fragmentation, but the existing marsh plain is pretty high. So it means you have an opportunity here. So you can think of things like thin layer placement or sediment augmentation. You can think about things like runnels, things like revegetating areas that might be bare, right? Because you have this elevation capital that's already built. So maybe you can lower the UVVR and gain some lifespan. And just visually, I should probably pick some new examples, but this is just an example from New Jersey showing what those kind of look like. Again, the most interesting one is the restore case where you have lots of open water, especially in New Jersey, lots of ditching, open water conversion, but in this location, relatively high marsh plain that's existing. In the bottom right, really degraded marsh parcel, but this marsh parcel is bordering three neighborhoods, an elementary school, and this is actively a restoration site for New Jersey because of the protection it's offering that infrastructure as well as that neighborhood. All right, so what does this look like in Maine? So this is an example of what we have found very often where we go in with our products, and if I pick some examples based on my own eye and I show them to stakeholders and practitioners, 9 times out of 10, those are areas they're already working in. That's the case in actually in this example here. When I pointed this out to New Jersey, they said, yep, that's an active restoration project. So this happened in Maine as well. So this is a Spurwink Marsh off Sawyer Road. So Sawyer Road is here with this yellow, what do you call them? Star. So this is already a restoration project. This road has been flooding, and the marshes on both sides of the road, because of an undersized culvert, are somewhat degraded. The seaward marshes more than the landward marshes. And Fish and Wildlife and the towns and other partners have been working to restore that culvert in order to improve the flow, and I think that project is currently underway. And when we brought this as an example, the partners were like, yep, we know, we're already working there, and that seems to happen. But the point is that you can then use these data to kind of justify those decisions and use them down the line to make further decisions. So when you look at our data, again, here are those polygons showing you what's vegetated and what's not vegetated. You can throw them in the decision matrix, pick some thresholds for elevation and UVVR, and all of that interior pops up as restore because it's high in elevation, but it's got significant open water ponding and a very high UVVR. So it's a great opportunity to regain some ecosystem services by modifying this culvert, improving tidal flow, improving tidal range, improving drainage, and potentially revegetating a lot of those areas. These products now are in use by folks in Maryland and New Jersey as well as a way to sort of justify restoration projects before they're permitted, where you can use these metrics and say, well, I want to propose a living shoreline because the unit behind it happens to be in the protect quadrant, so it's high value. Or you can justify a run-a-lean project because it's a restore option. The last decision matrix example I wanted to show leverages our mice migration data set. So this is a new analysis that we've developed for the Northeast. We published it for the Chesapeake. We finished it in Maine with a lot of feedback. Maine was actually the first place we tested this with the stakeholders there. And again, I'm not going to get into the methods, but what you're seeing in red is the migration area that's being used by the state of Maine. This is their Maine Natural Areas Program layer. What we do is we take our marsh units and we overlay that with the migration space and the catchments within the migration space, and we assign a migration area to each existing marsh unit. So it's kind of giving you a migration potential of an existing marsh into new upland catchments. What I'm showing here on the y-axis of the decision matrix is the ratio of the migration rate, the migration space to the current area of the migration unit. So high ratio means you're a small unit with a huge migration space. So that's what's on the Y here. And then on the X is lifespan. So again, high lifespan means high in elevation and an intact marsh plain, so in good shape. So you can imagine mapping a decision on this. So if you have a marsh unit that's existing now, that's got a high lifespan, so it's very intact, and it's got a very good migration potential, that's a no-brainer. You want to protect that. So you can see two very good examples here in the dark blue. These are two upland units that have substantial migration space to move into through these catchments that are pretty well delineated by the MNAP program. And because they're relatively small, that's a pretty good bang for the buck. So these are ones that you definitely want to pay attention to. Maybe if they're being tidally restricted, you want to make sure that they don't have a restriction and making sure that their upland migration space is unimpeded. In pink, you have units with a relatively high ratio, but the lifespan is low. So these are ones where if you have restoration funds or opportunities available, you would engage in restoration in order to make that migration possible. So this big unit here, if it's degraded, which the data are telling us it is, by restoring it, you're gaining access to the migration space and potentially ensuring successful migration into it. This bottom right one is interesting because this is a low migration ratio according to the geospatial data, but it's intact. And we have this one unit that pops up where you're kind of like, well, wait a second, what's going on here? And what you see is that it's actually being restricted by this road crossing where the polygons are not touching. geospatially, right? In the analysis, they don't have a shared border. So the data are telling you that from a geospatial sense, they're not connected. So this would be a place where you would go in and then determine, well, is there actually continuity between this existing marsh and this migration space? And if not, do we need to remedy that and enable access to this upland migration corridor? On the right here is our current coverage map for these metrics for everything up to lifespan. The marsh migration is being currently developed. Well, it's developed. We're currently applying it to everywhere other than the Chesapeake, which we haven't finished. So we're going to have it continuously for all these areas in one data release. So all these metrics will be available. New Jersey, Delaware side is in progress right now, will be published soon. And then we're going to move on to New Hampshire, and then Rhode Island and Delaware after that. So as we all know, the gold standard for understanding what is going on in a marsh is really the things that we do on the ground. So measuring sediment budgets, measuring the health of the vegetation, whether it's above ground biomass, below ground biomass, sulfites in the root zone, whatever it is, RTK for the elevation, SCTs for the elevation trajectory. But as we know, we can't do that everywhere all the time. It's just technically impossible, right? And it's never going to be spatially complete with those techniques. The Marsh unit framework gives us a leg up on that because now we can break the marsh into individual units, whether we can compute metrics on those units with existing data or with remote sensing data. Either way, we can now map things more comprehensively across the landscape, and that enables parcel scale management. And again, this isn't just about the UVVR, the lifespan, or anything else. We have mapped metrics from other partners up and down the East Coast. So any data set that exists, it's spatially complete or it's points, mapping it on marsh units still gives you this kind of coherent way to look at the data. And lastly, I think, and I think our partners agree to some degree, that these are how you want to guide your restoration investments, how you want to justify projects, and how you want to do a very quick first landscape scale assessment. One of the things that became very clear working with Maine, and what I really appreciated, was it was okay that we don't have all the answers. And we felt very liberated. I know Kate and I felt very good after those first couple meetings. I know the first meeting, Kate and I felt like, okay, maybe our data are not really going to work here. But as we continued to work with the partners, it was like, well, there are some aspects of our data that are really useful. There's other aspects that aren't, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be one size fits all. And so working with folks in order to find out what products they can use, what they can't use, and doing your best to modify those products for them kind of makes this job worth doing. And I want to thank Chris for giving us the opportunity and the rest of the team, and I will stop there. And if you want to find any of this data, you can just Google coastal wetland synthesis and it should be your first hit.
Thanks, Neil. Excellent as usual. And like this kind of data, it's what I found online. And then when I called Neil and he was willing to work with us, I was very excited. So the rest of the story that I'll tell for about the next 10 minutes, and then we want to open it up for you folks to have questions. And remember, if questions are occurring to you now, you can put them in the chat, especially after Neil's presentation, so that you don't forget them. So one of the products of this project, Marshes for Maine's Future, was a guide for people that work at that boundary spanning role. So as I developed this guide from all the data from the workshops, I was thinking of my colleagues in the Estuarine Research Reserve System who are training and engagement professionals. For about 20 years, the reserve system has had, initially it was called the Coastal Training Program, now it's called Training and Engagement. And so this guide was developed for people who work as boundary spanners, working at that interface between the geospatial tool developers and busy natural resource managers who frequently, when you tell them you have a new tool, they say, not another tool. Now, there are 9 national estuarine research reserves in the scope and realm of this USGS data. So I was thinking, how can I make their jobs easier if they're trying to do the same thing that we were? So the Boundary Spanners Challenge is, how can I work to ensure that people who will benefit from geospatial data can actually apply the tools rather than just having them do it totally on their own? So the guidebook that's developed for boundary spanners starts with this graphic And again, what I did is I analyzed everything we'd done over about a year and a half to turn it into a really practical guide. So if you're a training and engagement professional, you can literally go to this guide and everything you need to do the same thing we did was there. So it turns out our process was 9 steps. And then we also developed 13, because it was 13 and I couldn't figure out a way to make there be more or less tools. I just called them the lucky training tools. So this is everything from process agendas to surveys that we used on the project, and it's linked to what the goal of each training tool is. Now, here's some examples of what the training tools are. So we collected data from the team and we used a case study approach. So all along the way, for example, when we first started, we spent 4 months, not 4 months solid, but 4 months with a couple of webinars writing the proposal for how we would work together to get funding to support the project. So we used Survey 123, and we polled the people that were interested, the stakeholders, and we asked them things like, what geospatial layers do you currently use? What is the management issue you're going to apply this tool to? Who are the partners you're working with? And we asked them, like, what's your level of expertise and experience with GIS? Where are you going to apply the tool? And then questions about their project. So at all times, the application of the tool was related to something they're working on right now. And that made all the difference as far as you know, people are so busy. When we asked about experience with tools, here was our, for the people that were working on the project, most had intermediate or advanced. And beginner knowledge, we didn't discourage it, but we knew that geospatial tools can be hard to use. We just let people know that if they weren't having intermediate or advanced skills, we'd work with them and they'd be part of a team as long as someone else on the team had more advanced skills. And then a second thing, one of the biggest things about geospatial tool designers is they frequently don't have an idea, I don't think I'm stretching too far, about how long it will take a manager to actually use their tool. The tool designer might think this will be a piece of cake. I'm going to develop the tool. I'm going to post it up there on the web and they'll be able to use it. So in our proposal, we actually calculated how much time everybody working on the project would spend doing the project. So we calculated the time for workshops, we calculated the times to practice, and we told them how many hours during the year of the project they would be engaged in the project. And so everybody kind of knew. They helped us come up with this number, and they said, yep, I have time to engage in this project and spend this much time. So one of the tools in the toolkit is doing an assessment when you're asking people to use your tool of how much time they'll have to do to apply it. We had 4 knowledge sharing workshops. And again, for every one of these workshops in the toolkit is the process agenda and how we ran the training. This February training was the first time we met each other in person. In the fall of 23, we had 2 workshops that were virtual. We recorded those, and anyone who wanted to join the project as we moved along, they could see what we did in the first 2 workshops and prepare for this in-person 2-day workshop. So the workshop, the USGS data projects that Neil described, those were the ones we were going to use. We linked everybody so they could test the tools ahead of time. And we learned from the first 2 workshops exactly what people were going to be working on. Everybody came to this in-person data application workshop with their project that they were working on to apply it in that case. And then, surprise, people found out at the beginning of the 2 days that by the end of the second day, they were going to be doing a presentation to the rest of the group about their case study and how they applied the tools. We gave kind of a PowerPoint template and said, by the end of the second day, you're going to fill in what you did and your project and how you applied the tools and share that with everybody else in the room. One of the examples of a project, when people finished these projects, that was February. And what we charged people with doing is, as you continue to work on your projects during the summer, use these tools, and in September, we're going to all get back together and you'll be doing a capstone presentation of how you applied the tools, what worked, what didn't work. And at that capstone, at the end of the field season, we invited lots of other people who hadn't worked with us to see what we did and how the tools worked. Now this one, I have to look at my notes because this is the capstone presentation by my colleague, Jake Amon, who's the stewardship director here at the Wells Reserve. He was working on Spurwink Marsh, the same example that Neil gave, with colleagues from Fish and Wildlife Service, which was both the Rachel Carson Refuge and the Gulf of Maine program, and also our colleague from the Casco Bay NEP who was on the project. The Spurwink Marsh, again, same pictures that Neil showed. Some of the land in that marsh is owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are the spots where restoration projects are continuing to unfold. I have to tell a true story, though. Originally, at the time we did this training, Fish and Wildlife, the Reserve, and the towns of Cape Elizabeth and Scarborough were talking very earnestly about, can you see me? I don't know if you can see my arrow, but removing this road. And the hopes were at that time that this road might be removed and the restoration would be related to that road removal. Well, as many of you know, if you're working on marsh projects, when we got to the time where the towns were voting about removing the road, this is another story in itself. One town was in favor and one town was not, so the road removal was off the table. But there's still restoration going around the culvert that goes under that road. Now this shows the marsh units that were calculated using the USGS methods. And there were 2 big marsh units, but as the group was working on this, and this was another lesson learned, they kind of combined the USGS technique with another project that's kind of led by Dave Burdick at University of New Hampshire and Sue Adamovich. And that was looking at a smaller scale unit. And one of the reasons the team had to do this is Maine is a low tide state. So many of the marshes are owned by private people. I'm sure other folks have this situation. So when you're doing a restoration project, the refuge land, you could collaborate and work on the refuge, but other parcels in the area are privately owned and it's very complicated to work with many individual landowners. So the smaller tide shed, and this kind of addresses what Neil said about concern about the scale of their data and decision making. So this is for the engagement professionals. As part of the grant for the project, we had a local GIS specialist who we had working on the project with us because the USGS folks couldn't be up with us all the time. They traveled to Maine many times, but we had our local GIS specialist who was on the grant from the beginning. And as our team worked in the summer to look for restoration decisions in this space, Judy Colby-George of Viewshed Consulting helped scale down the data so decisions could be made on restorations in this spot. So unless you have someone on your staff who could fill this role of providing extra help for GIS, I recommend having someone on the project who can help your teams as they're moving forward. So the UVVR data in the smaller scale showed that some of the parcels that were privately owned as well as the Fish and Wildlife. And remember, the color scheme is red areas have high UVVR and are very vulnerable, and the greener areas are in better shape as far as elevation and UVVR. So this is working from that original USGS down to a smaller scale. And then applying the decision matrix, the blue areas are protect as far as manage, and the tan areas are where restoration projects would take place. And what Fish and Wildlife and other partners are looking at is runneling and kind of draining the wet areas out of the marsh. So this was a project, it continues to this day, but during our interaction with Marshes for Maine's Future, this team and others in the state worked together on this project. Now, just kind of a summary, and we want to open it. Let me check my time. Yes, want to open it up to questions. What is it about this boundary spanning? What were the key takeaways? So number one is collaboration to prepare the proposal. Like I said, over a 4-month period with so many emails and a couple of meetings, I confirmed with my colleagues in Maine that this USGS tool, they wanted it. And they wanted to do this project, and they wanted to work on the schedule 4 workshops over a year and apply it to this work. And the second clue, or the second secret ingredient, is because the use of the tool was projects they were currently working in, it didn't make extra work. It wasn't a training about something that didn't relate to work. And every time we got together, they were making progress on their work in the state of Maine. That idea of having a local geospatial consultant, when USGS folks had to move on to other things, we had someone in the state trained who works regularly with the state and communities, and she understood the process as well. We had the 4 knowledge sharing workshops that were co-designed with the marsh managers. We used the case study approach, where they're actually, this is a marsh I'm working in, I'm going to try the tools. And then a summer of working in the field and using the tools there. Then the capstone helped us spread the method through the state. So we invited everybody else who's working in marshes. We even had folks from the Passamaquoddy tribe travel over 4 hours to the workshop. That they actually are further away than Neil is on Cape Cod. And then the last part of this, let me see if I've got that, my little thing covering that. We even developed an additional workshop, which everybody showed up to, the concept of a geospatial tool workday. And everybody kind of said, that's my ideal day. And a geospatial tool workday is a set aside time where you come to the Wells Reserve and you bring your current projects with folks in the room who can help you. So imagine if in your state, you could have like a 20-person meeting with all the people working with geospatial tools in your state on marshes, and you spend the day sharing knowledge and working on challenges. So my indication that that was a productive thing was not only the evaluation, but also the fact that everybody still came, even though it hadn't been in our original design. Now, Neil talked a little bit, and once again, when he talked about the marsh migration tool, I said, oh my gosh, I got to get everybody in Maine together and work on that. And we've also been, I'll also be offering trainings and technical assistance to boundary spanners. So any of my NERRS colleagues or anyone else who is a boundary spanner, I mean, you literally email me so we can set up a time to talk, and I can, spend 20 minutes in going into more detail with this. So with that, I want to stop and see if anybody has questions for Neil or I.
Thanks, folks. It looks like you do have a question in the Q&A there. And somebody also chatted a question. Other folks, feel free to go ahead and either raise your hand if you have a question that you want to verbalize, or type it into the chat or the Q&A.
I can handle, well, I can handle Brian's easily. You're welcome, Brian.
Sure.
To James' question about native versus non-native. So that's something we did map in an area where a partner, and not in Maine, but in Maryland, Virginia, where a partner did have a presence-absence map of Phragmites. And what we did is we mapped that onto marsh units for Assateague National Seashore and Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, so that we could then come up with a decision matrix, which I actually showed in a different talk, of migration ratio versus Phragmites presence or absence, with the idea being that if you've got a marsh unit that has high migration ratio, but it's got the presence of Phragmites, you might need to take an action to eliminate Phragmites. Whereas if you had a unit with no migration space and it's covered in Phragmites, you can just let it be because you're not going to get frag migrating. So you can map anything on a marsh unit. You just have to have the data available. And identifying species of plants is an active area of research for many. It's difficult, but can be done.
Yes, and resources for at least the boundary spanning portion, I've put them all in a Google folder, and we'll be sure that you get that link to the Google folder so that you can read the papers or see examples. Well, the slides will also, oh, good. And that's the Google. If you have any trouble accessing the Google folder, I can answer an email and just send you the documents. But what we've got in there are 3 papers about boundary spanning, if that's an area that's new to you, and then samples of some of the other, the guidebooks that are just clickable links. So let me know if you can't access that link, just send me an email.
Some more comments in the chat for you, Chris. Saying, I have a USGS project picking back up to use other spatial tools. I'm going to work with Megan to find out who is using these data in Massachusetts and how.
Great. Yes, I knew Massachusetts, and you guys are lucky you're close to the USGS office. I'm kind of jealous of Massachusetts.
We have just a few minutes left, so I might transition us here to wrapping up. If you do have questions that occur to you towards the end or after the webinar, you can feel free to either drop them into the exit survey or email one of the presenters or myself as an organizer. You can email me too. The exit survey will open up automatically when you close the session. We do read the comments, so we encourage you to submit any feedback that you have, both for the presentation, like how the presentations around the webinar series is run, or for the presenters. So feel free to use that to give us feedback. Our next webinar is on March 31st. We're doing sort of a public-facing promo of the Indigenous Knowledge and Sovereignty collection that we developed earlier this year, and released earlier this year, I should say. So we'll be doing that at the end of the month. You can look out for announcements for that one. And we have another webinar coming up in April that is not quite on the calendars yet, but it is lined up. So keep an eye out for announcements if you have them. Thank you so much to Chris and Neil for putting together such a great presentation and for talking through everything. I know this is like such a complicated topic, and it was just just so well done and just thoughtful the way you two both kind of hit all the steps and walked us through the project again. It kind of felt like I was like reliving all of our check-in calls like in just like rapid fire again. So that's really cool for me. So thank you both, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
Neil and Nick.
Take care.